A Guardian's Tale, written and narrated by YonathanJ. Part 6. The Old Man's Regrets. I have fled these memories all my life, and just now, before death, do I face them, with such regret and pain that I can't help crying. Yet hear my words and witness the truth of my life, for I was blind, simply in a different way. Blind to see the world as it really was. I wasn't always an old man, whoever you are, and I wasn't always blind, though perhaps in a way I was. You see, it all started with her smile. My wife. Well, back then she was but a stranger at our village, yet our eyes would meet, and her smile would enchant me like no other things in this earthly life. The rising sun and the beauty of nature was nothing compared to her smile, and I spent years adoring and worshipping that memory, until at last she came up to me. She perhaps knew of the spell she casted on me, and no later than a few weeks we were married, and so happy we were. The world was a bright, warm place, and under the sun we built a house, made love every day, and soon enough we had our first child, a boy, and so healthy and loud he was. Although it was a difficult childbirth, I remember the blood, so much blood, and as my wife held our son in her arms, I could only stare in shock at the bed, covered in red. And her. She was as white as the bed sheets used to be, and I took a hold of the midwife. She was panicking. I kissed my wife on her forehead, and my son that I loved so much already, and ran out to fetch a physician. I had to do something to save my dear love. As we came back with haste, I found our house empty, except for the crying of my boy. I approached the bed, while the physician opened his suitcase of tools and concoctions. I looked at my angelic wife and expected worse. Yet she was still breathing softly. And so I took my boy in my arms and begged the man to save her. My boy was crying and crying, and I was as well. To think I could lose her so suddenly, I was going mad. Yet the physician laid fresh towels on her head, applied bandages, and busied himself for a while. I couldn't tell if she was going to be fine or not. It was hell. And then a knock on the door. I remember I ignored it, yet the knocking was incessant. I left her bedside and opened the door, and there, standing on my porch, the priest. I slammed the door on him, and he was gone. You see, I always hated whatever god our village worshipped, and the further away from it I was, the better. Anyway, after a few hours, my wife got better. It seemed like the nightmare of that night was finally going to be behind us. I took a few weeks, but eventually my dear wife got a bit better, and so glad I was. Our little boy was growing quickly. From that day onward, though, my wife grew somewhat distant. I gave her love, support, and space, for I loved her so dearly. Yet she refused me every day, and no longer would we make love as we used to do. She was also weaker and spent a lot of time in bed. I had duties and couldn't be by her side at all times, however much I wanted. I had her land to tend, her livestock to care for, and my boy to raise as a man. I remember just how angry I was at the time, at life, for breaking my beautiful wife. I took over cooking and cleaning and brought her meals and drinks. Even back then she was the prettiest woman of them all, smiling and discussing with me, tucked in her bed. Despite my anger, I was also relieved. What would we have become if we had lost her? One Sunday morning, my wife held me by the arm and asked me to go to church together. She had always been quite a believer, and her prayers never did annoy me, for I knew she worshipped nature's beauty over any deity. Yet never before did she ask to go to church. I offered her instead a walk outside, and she agreed. For the first time in a bit less than 2 years now, all three of us are outside as a family. And how I cherish this memory. Our little boy holding our hands between us, the wind blowing in my wife's hair, the sun shining in her eyes, and her smile. I can still see her smile, carved in my mind, so precious she is to me. Our boy let go of our hands and ran away along the road, and she lost balance, falling in my arms. She kissed me as she used to do so long ago. Her cheeks were red, and I held her so close that I cried. I missed her so much. But on the distance, grey clouds, and inside of me, lust. I wanted her. She was so warm and beautiful. I called for my boy and we turned around. I remember my wife was struggling to keep up, and many times I had to walk a bit slower as she held on to my arm. The clouds were approaching, and I could feel in the wind the rain coming. Perhaps even a terrible storm. We made it home just after rain started. Soaked, we entered our home, closed the windows, and dried ourselves. I sent our boy to his room and embraced my wife, yet she pushed me away once more. You see, I wanted her. I needed her, and I thought perhaps she had gained back her health after her day outside. We went to bed and slept to the sound of the rain all around us. Day after day the rain fell, and after tending to my duties I came back home to my loving and sick wife and my son playing in his room quietly. How I wanted her, and how angry I was at the world at being soaked every day under the deluge, and at her for refusing me every day. I decided that night I'd open one of her wine bottles and share it with her. And under the thunder of the storm I forced myself on her, putting the blame on the empty bottle of wine there on her bedside. She never did handle wine well. The day after, the rain had stopped at last. We awoke to the sun shining through our curtains, and how glad I was that the rain was over. Yet our son cried for us, and I ran to the kitchen, and saw my dear boy, 2 feet in a puddle of water, looking at the roof that was leaking. A disaster! I had no choice but to spend the next few days busy on the roof repairing any damages. Back then I knew, but didn't want to admit it, that most of the house was soaked, and I foolishly believed it would dry in the sun. About a month later, 2 things changed. First, my wife told me, crying, that she was pregnant again. How happy I was. Second, black mushrooms sprouted from corners of our house. How disgusted I was. And shamelessly I hid that from my family. Every morning I would awake before anyone else and find any mushroom and rot and scrape them away. The house was as clean as ever, yet its inside was rotten. No matter, since no one else than I knew. A few weeks later I threw a bit of a celebration, inviting friends and friends of friends over to announce our next child. I remember how cold and distant my wife was back then, claiming she was feeling a bit under the weather. If only I had known. Weeks became months, and my wife was perhaps a few weeks before childbirth. I had prepared everything to avoid a disaster like the last time. Every week the physician would come visit and run tests and ask her questions, and we were certain that this time no trouble would arise. Yet every day she held my arm and told me how scared she was. How scared she was of the pain coming back to her. In her eyes I could see fear and despair. Every time I held her close and comforted her, fooling ourselves. Until at last that day came, and how unprepared we were. It was early morning, and the sun was nowhere to be seen. She cried and cried, shaking me to go fetch the physician. And so I did, and this time the childbirth lasted only a few hours. There was still an awful lot of blood, and this time not red, but as black as the hidden rot of our house. I was mortified, and I held on to my wife's hand as she wailed in pain, pushing and pushing, to at last give birth to our new child, a girl this time. She named her Joan. To our horror, she wasn't crying, and only after the physician tapped on her back a few times did she start breathing and crying. Relieved, my wife looked at the physician, and he gave her a glass of water that she chugged. A few minutes later, my dear wife was sleeping, almost smiling. The physician told me he had prepared a remedy for her pain, an elixir. He put the white bottle on her bedside, instructing me to put a few drops in a glass of water before sleep every night. I thanked him dearly, paid him for his services, and laid on the bed next to her, with our beautiful daughter between us. Our boy was sitting next to us, drawing. I remember just how bittersweet I felt, and how uneasy I was at my daughter's lack of energy. She simply lay there, looking around, not even crying anymore, her eyes a deep black. Over the next few weeks, my dear wife would demand for more and more of the elixir, claiming that the pain wasn't going away. I gave her a few more drops, then a spoonful, and soon enough she wanted some in the morning as well. I bought some more from the physician that warned me of its addiction, yet I foolishly thought she wasn't addicted, that she just was in pain. Weeks became months, and I realized too late that my dear wife was but a shadow of herself. In a moment of lucidity, I took away the elixir and poured it on the ground outside as she cried and cried. A few days later, she broke a plate and opened her arm with it. She died in her bed. The pain was too much for her. And the worst part is, it's my boy that found her. My daughter is still sucking at her breast. My son was shocked and didn't understand. My tiny daughter was hungry and I had to feed her cow milk from then on. Thinking back, I was simply shocked as well. Why would she put an end to her life so suddenly? At first I thought that perhaps it was an accident, or that perhaps someone else had sneaked in and killed her. How stupid. Yet I realized with time that it was I that killed her, day after day, year after year. My love was a poison, and our house was rotten, and the sun was nowhere to be seen. I remember one late winter night when my daughter was about 7 years old. She had been sick most of her childhood, and even at 7 she would wet her bed and wake up crying. It was too much for me. I remember that one night I sat on my bed and felt a shiver all over. I looked at the door that was open and saw a small figure standing there, looking at me with soft red glowing eyes. I was petrified. For hours she stood there, her gaze a nightmare, until at last I stood up, walked up to her and held her in my arms. She was as cold as the night. Something was terribly wrong with her. The next day our house burned down in a disaster, and we had to move with some old friends until we found somewhere else to live. During that time my daughter took a habit of visiting the church more and more, until one night she didn't come home. Turns out she wished to live at the monastery. I saw no objection. 15 years later, I was still blaming myself for my wife's death. My son grew to become a good man, healthy and prosperous. He was a carpenter by trade, and built a great many houses in our village that was turning into a town. Jacob was his name. I was growing old and spent my day at my hunter's cabin, where I was laying traps and hunting pheasants and critters. My life was empty, yet I deserved it. And my daughter, my poor, sweet daughter, never came to see me. I learned she had grown to be shy and reserved, preferring studying the verses of faith than living her life. What I regret most of all is the one day where I stumbled upon her by accident as I was coming back from the market. I was walking by the cemetery next to the church when I saw someone there next to a tombstone, leaning on it, holding something. I walked closer and noticed that was my daughter. I recognized her long black hair. I considered not talking to her, for I was afraid of her, but I decided I should at least try. I got closer, called her name, yet she didn't answer. I entered the cemetery, and she was leaning there on the ground, right next to her mother's tombstone, next as well to a bouquet of black flowers. My daughter, much older and taller than what I remembered, was wearing a white immaculate robe, and in her hair white jewelry made out of bones. She herself was dirty, and on her face a bit of dried blood and traces of tears on her cheeks. In her arms I saw a kitten, yet the kitten was wounded, its skull half open, and the kitten itself was barely alive. She was holding it very dearly in her arms, softly singing a lullaby, not minding me at all. She would chase away with a wave of her hand any flies, and keep on singing, bobbling her head back and forth. What horror! I thought, surely that isn't my daughter. Surely that isn't my blood. That isn't the product of our love. Surely she cannot be my dear wife's daughter. And yet she was, and looking at her I felt it, the weight of my regrets. I wished to take the dying kitten away, of taking her by the arms and bringing her home. I wished to throw buckets of water at her, of shouting at her, of sitting her down at school, and I wished, oh, so dearly, to give her a proper chance at life. Yet I left her there, and ran back to my cabin, where I isolated myself for years. I was paralyzed by a life devoid of meaning, by the atrocity of existence, by how unfair and ugly it all was.